Good morning, my no, it's good afternoon. Good afternoon, my dear friends. Good evening. And yesterday I was not able to meet you physically. I intended to meet you virtually yesterday, but because of certain activities that I was engaged in, I was not able to meet you virtually. But I gave you an assignment. I uploaded the materials in your Google Classroom, and I trust that you were able to download the material, and I also trust that you have religiously read the assigned topic that I gave you. And one of the topic that I assigned you is the concept of the article on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the launching and sustaining a revolution, written by Paul Gordon Loren. And appended in that article also was a copy of a summarized copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And also, I assigned you to read an article about Does Culture Matter, written by Abdullahi an Naim. So these two articles are important. Because this will give us a background on the topic that we are discussing. So first of all, bakit sinabi ni Paul Gordon Loren that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was some sort of a launching and sustaining a revolution? So pag sinabi nating revolution, what do we understand by revolution? When we say revolution, it has something to do with drastic change, an event or a movement that changes everything in an abrupt way. So in what way does human rights, in what way does the Universal Declaration of Human Rights fade away for a revolution? So ito ang sasagutin natin sa article nito na binasa natin, na sinabi sa atin ni Paul Gordon Loren. So sabi niya, it is a form of a launching and sustaining a revolution. So let us give a background about human rights. Bakit napakahalaga ng Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Because when the United Nations was founded in 1948 as a body, that was the first time that they launched this body. And in launching this body, they issued the first document, the first international document entitled the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Take note, class, that this declaration, this document is a declaration. So it is not yet a law, or maybe it does not have the force of a law, but it is a declaration, some sort of statement of principle. So parang ano rin siya, parang batas na rin siya. Anyway, it's like a international law, parang yung constitution natin. Yung constitution natin, halimbawa sa Pilipinas, ang Philippine Constitution is the one that we considered as the highest law of the land. But as the highest law of the land, it is but a declaration, meaning to say it needs some enabling law in order to be able to implement the provisions of this declaration. Kumbaga, ang Constitution, this is the broad principles, the broad guidelines, the broad policy that will guide the operation of the Republic. So in other words, ito naman na sinasabi natin na Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a kind of declaration akin to a constitution. Parang constitution din siya. Kaya lang ito ay nasa international level. Kumbaga, this becomes the guiding principles for all the actions and accountability of the members of the community of nations. Yan. Of the community of nations, meaning the nation states, the recognized nation states, and especially those who are members of the United Nations organization. And one of the most important person associated with this United Nations Declaration on Human Rights is Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt was a member. He was the chair of the committee that draft and would have become known as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And they had no idea that their efforts would have such an enormous impact, napakalaki ng impact ng declaration na ito, because it changed the culture. It changed the way nations behave each other. and it changed also the way nations treat their own citizens. And sometimes, hindi lang sometimes, but most of the time, itong Human Rights Declaration na ito, itong Universal Declaration of Human Rights becomes the basis for other treaties, other protocols, other forms of international law, and also it becomes incorporated in most of the constitutions of the countries who are members of the United Nations. At nabago yung pananaw ng mga tao, yung mga practices natin, kasi nga sa pamamagitan ng Universal Declaration of Human Rights, nabigyan ng boses ang tinatawag natin na karapatang pantao. Because previously in the history of humankind, particularly prior to the First and Second World War, the word human rights was never mentioned. It was not articulated. Although in principle, it is already existing in the minds of some political leaders and some philosophers and social activists. But at the time sa mga panahon na yon hindi pa siya masyadong tanggap. Kaya lang, pagkatapos ng ikalawang digmaan, sabi nga, ang Second World War, napakalaki ang impact ng Second World War sa buhay ng mga tao sa mundo. Sapagkat ito ang pinakamalaking digmaan na nangyari sa mundo na na-involve ang maraming bansa. And the destruction of the Second World War was enormous. There was an enormous destruction. There was an enormous effect on the life, the violence, the homeless people, the rights of people that were violated. Kaya naisip nila, itong mga liberal politicians, naisip nila na probably the main reason why there is conflict in the world today is because people do not respect human rights. And when we speak of human rights, it is always connected with the concept and idea of what we call human dignity. Because every human person has dignity. Meron tayong dignidad. So ngayon, dignity is a very abstract concept. Mahirap siyang intindihin, pero I think na pag nabanggit yung salitang dignity, ito ay alam na natin, nasa isip na natin kung ano ang ibig sabihin ng dignity. Because dignity has something to do with the freedom of the will. Because every human being has freedom of the will. Meron tayong kalayaan. Meron tayong freedom of the will na, kumbaga, meron tayong sariling pagdidesisyon. Kaya nga ang mga tao, I'm speaking from the philosophical point of view, kaya nga ang mga tao ay, quote-unquote, tayo ay is to be, to become. When you are born, you become. Kaya nga sa constitution natin, sinasabi dyan, parang meron tayong principle na sinasabi na all men are born equal. So lahat ng tao na nabuhay, all human beings are born equal. Pero hindi ibig sabihin ng equal ay pare-pareho. Because we are born in different kinds of situations. But theoretically, in principle, all of us are born equal because all of us have the potentiality to become. That's why it is the incumbent right of every person to be given that environment, to be, for those people responsible to facilitate the growth of the child so that the child will be able to fully develop as a human being and will be able to maximize his potential as a human being. Yan po ang ibig sabihin ng to become, to be, to become. And diyan nakapalaman, nakadugtong yung tinatawag natin na karapatang pantao. Sapagkat tayo ay may karapatan na maging tao. Kaya nga, yung mga bagay na humahadlang sa ating development, yung mga bagay-bagay na humahadlang sa ating kalayaan na desisyonan kung ano ang ating magiging future, yung mga bagay na humahadlang sa ating kasiyahan, yan ang ibig sabihin natin na violation of human rights. They violate human rights. Kaya nga, di ba, yung last discussion natin, sinabi ko doon na may iba-ibang uri ng human rights. Meron tayong tinatawag na inalienable rights at meron naman tayong tinatawag na civil and political rights. Ito kasi pag sinabi natin na inalienable, from the root word alien, meaning to say, it is something that cannot be separated from us. It is part of our being human. Because pag inalis mo ang mga bagay na to, hindi na siya magiging tao. So in other words, when you violate this right, you are violating the very core. You are attacking the very core of the human person. So primarily, ano ang mga examples ng mga inalienable rights? Number one is the right to live. Yan. Lahat ng tao ay may karapatang mabuhay. That's why we considered killing as a violation of human rights. That's why in modern legal history, we do not accept death penalty because death penalty is barbaric. Di ba? Hindi siya makatao. Sapagkat ang tao, pag pinatay mo siya, siya ay inaalis mo sa kanya ang karapatan na maging tao. So wala tayong karapatan na alisin o kitilin ang buhay ng tao. Although sinasabi ng iba na na kung anong anya ang kinuha mong buhay, dapat yun din ang ibalik. But that is not that is a reality, but that is not what we think life should be. Because every human being should be given the chance to live. Because sabi nga natin, you cannot correct a wrong by another wrong. Halimbawa, pinatay niya yung isang tao, hindi natin pwedeng patayin din siya. Kasi nga, mali nga yung pagpatay. So kung papatayin mo siya, that's another mistake that you are going to do. But it doesn't mean that we are not going to render justice. Justice will still be rendered because there will still be some form of punishment. But the punishment that given to the offender must be something which is restorative. Meaning to say, ang isang tao na nagkasala ay pinaparusahan, pero yung pagpaparusa na ginagawa sa kanya ay dapat ito ay maging daan para matuto siya, ma-realize niya ang kanyang pagkakamali, at ito ang maging daan para siya ay magbagong buhay at maging mabuting tao sa hinaharap. Yan po ang ibig sabihin ng restorative justice, hindi yung punitive justice. Kasi yung punitive justice, yun ang tinatawag natin na an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Another example of inalienable rights is the freedom of speech, the freedom of thought, the freedom of religion. So in other words, we are free to speak our minds. We are free to practice our religion. We are free to practice what we think is right. I think these are things that we need to understand. Kailangan maintindihan po natin itong mga bagay na to. Okay. Okay. Kaya lang, in 1948, when they make the Declaration of Human Rights, when they declared human rights, there were some controversial questions that arise. Kasi nga bago pa lang 'yon. Kumbaga sa tao, ipinapanganak pa lang siya. So nagkaroon ng mga maraming tanong. So for example, ang mga tanong is, what exactly is human rights? And what is the source of human rights? Is it something that is from God? Or is it from our own nature? Or does it come from our reason? Or is it something that is given to us by our government? And other questions like, for example, whom do they apply? Can universal rights be claimed by all people? Yan. So can they be universally claimed by all people? Or are they restricted to a particular gender, race, class, state, culture, or states of development? What is the connection between human rights and peace and security and justice? So these are the questions that will arise in yan. Okay. Now, sabi dito, politics also greatly endanger the task at hand. Whatever euphoria existed from the Allied victory of the Second World War, bigla itong naglaho. Kaya nga sa katapusan ng Second World War, natuwa ang mga tao because it was the victory of the Allied forces. The Allied forces defeated Nazi Germany. The Allied forces defeated the Imperial Japan. And there was euphoria. Napakasaya nila kasi natapos na ang digmaan. But just as the war was quickly concluded, it gave rise to new problems. Ano itong mga significant problems na ito na doon na-test yung katatagan ng Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The first is the Soviet Union was imposing the Iron Curtain over Eastern Europe. So if we are aware of our history, kasaysayan sa Western Europe, di ba nang matapos ng yung digmaan, then the Soviet Union began to impose its will on the countries of Eastern Europe, like, for example, Bulgaria, Albania, Yugoslavia, and the other countries in Eastern Europe were all under the influence of the Soviet Union. Yung Soviet Union or USSR is the former Russian Empire. So, kaya nga sabi nga ni Winston Churchill, there was an iron curtain cast over Eastern Europe kasi nga all these countries were under the influence or the orbit of influence of the USSR, and they were insulated from the West and from the rest of the world. Then second, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union was expanding. So in other words, noong Allied during Second World War, the US and the Soviet Union or the USSR were magkakampi sila. But after the Cold War, there was a rivalry among them for influence, for power in the world. Kaya lang, they were afraid to openly confront each other, knowing that both of them possess nuclear powers, superpower capabilities. So therefore, they were not willing to face each other, confront each other, but rather they just resorted into some, nagkaroon nga sila ng tinatawag na Cold War. Then also, you have also the strategic arms race, yung paramihan ng armas, paramihan ng warhead, paramihan ng missiles, to such a point that the security of the world is now in danger because both the US and the USSR possess weapons of mass destruction that can assure the destruction of each other. Okay. Then another is the Berlin blockades was emerging. The violence was exploding in the colonial empires. And also at the time, there was significant events in China, for example. Mao Zedong and his Communist Party defeated the Nationalist Party in China. And also, there was the armed conflict in Palestine revolving around the creation of the new state of Israel. Kasi nga yung mga dating mga Hudyo na from Europe who were victims of Nazi Germany, they started moving to Europe. Then there was also the race riots, and India was publicly confronting South Africa over its policies of apartheid. And then private individuals suddenly were challenging their own governments over the violation of human rights before the eyes of the world. Okay. Sorry. So as we go further, itong tinatawag natin na Universal Declaration of Human Rights ay nanganak sa ibang mga issues. Okay, nanganak siya sa ibang mga issues. Ano itong mga issues na to? For example, out of this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, several UN treaties were approved or protocol were ratified by nation members. Like, for example, the Declaration of the Rights of the Child, which was ratified in 1959. Then you have the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to colonial countries and peoples. This was ratified in 1960s. Then you have the Declaration on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination in 1963. Then you have the Declaration of the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women in 1967. Then you have the Declaration on the Protection of All Persons from Being Subject to Torture in 1975. And then you also have the Declaration on the Elimination of All Forms of Intolerance and of Discrimination based on religion or belief. And this was in 1981. Then you have the Declaration on the Right to Development, 1986. And then you have the Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples in 2007. And there were many other more. Among these are like the European Convention on Human Rights, the Convention relating to the status of refugees, the Convention on Political Rights of Women, etc., etc. And those who created the Universal Declaration of Human Rights hardly could have imagined the widespread impact that it would have on the world during the course of its first 60 years. And they would be amazed that their vision, despite all of the odds against it at the beginning and all the resistance that has been mounted against it, since it accomplished so much. And never before in history have there been so many achievements in promoting, extending, enhancing, and actually protecting human rights. And nevertheless, not all of the UDHR vision has been fully realized. Severe abuses of human rights still exist. It is precisely for that reason that the revolution launched and sustained by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights must continue. So my dear friends, I hope that you have read the article, and I would advise you to read also the preamble and also the contents of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that is located in page 45 of the manual that I shared to you. So my dear friends, thank you so much for listening to this brief lecture, and please go to your Google Classroom, because I am going to give you a short activity that you need to accomplish today until tomorrow at 9 o'clock in the morning. So thank you very much, my friends. Here from my office in the graduate school, I would like to greet all of you a wonderful evening. And sorry if we could not, if we were not able to meet. And I hope that all of you are doing better. I hope that all of you are in good conditions. And if you have questions, please don't hesitate to message me or to ask me questions. If there's anything that you need to be clarified, please don't hesitate to ask me questions, because as your professor, instructor, I always believe that learning happens 24/7, and whatever our situation in life is, we should always tawag dito, we should always be ready to answer questions from you. So thank you, my friends.